If you were president, would you declassify, you can answer yes or no to this, would you declassify the 9/11 files?
Yeah.
Would you declassify JFK files?
Yeah.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
All right.
I guess I would. I think that less
Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight
So there's some crazy stuff happening in Mexico. There's been a wave of violence swept Mexico after security forces killed Jalisco New Generation cartel leader Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, I love those names, known as El Mencho in U.S.-backed military raid. Gunmen torched cars and blocked highways across several states in retaliation. But our good friend Nico House has something to say about it because it's interesting where the weapons are coming from.
Let's go ahead and say what everybody's been thinking. Of course, the United States is behind what's happening in Mexico right now. So in case you haven't seen the news the last couple of days, in Puerto Vallarta, there has been a war between the Mexican government and a huge cartel. Now, the capo of this cartel, El Mencho, was killed by the Mexican government. And then within hours, the Jalisco New Generation cartel hijacked buses, set cars on fire, blocked roads from Puerto Vallarta to Guadalajara. It almost looked as if this was a trained military operation, the way they acted so swiftly and the grade of weapons that they were using. And that's because the grade of weapons that they were using were military grade. And not just from any military, the United States. There have been multiple reports talking about how these drug syndicates, these cartels, have been overpowering the police with ammunition made for the U.S. military. And this has been a long-standing issue in Mexico. Since 2012, 137,000 50 caliber rounds have been seized that were traced back specifically to the U.S. Army. And for those of you who don't know, let me spell it out for you. 50 cals aren't those bullets that go pew pew. Those are the bullets that go like leave a hole in you big enough that Randy Fine could roll on through you. But in case you needed more proof, we can't forget in February 2026, there was a report that showed that 62% of U.S. source crime guns recovered in Mexico with short time to crime intervals were bought in from Arizona. Also, Arizona has been letting in 50 caliber rifles that are capable of downing helicopters and piercing armor. Oh, but it gets better. Here's DB Geopolitics referring back to a post that they made on September the 8th, 2025, showing that this cartel waging war with the Mexican government right now was being trained in Ukraine. In fact, recent intelligence suggests that the cartel traveled to Ukraine to get those weapons and bring them back into Mexico without a hiccup. And if they got weapons from Ukraine, we know Ukraine's weapons aren't actually made in Ukraine. They are made by whom? Ding, 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 the United States. So if those weapons made their way out of Ukraine all the way back to Mexico, when Trump supposedly has the most secure border out of every president in U.S. history, that likely means that the U.S. green-lighted that arrangement, wouldn't it? I mean, y'all, bullshit you not. In December, a federal grand jury of New York indicted Paul Campbell, who was the former deputy chief office of financial operations for the DEA under the Obama administration, for his role in narco-terrorism conspiracy, money laundering, and all that good stuff with this specific cartel. Like, at this point, it's just safe to assume that the U.S. and the CJNG have a closer relationship than me and my wife do. Now, don't y'all just find it a little bit coincidental that all of this happens just a little over a month after Trump announced that he wanted to conduct strikes in Mexico to take out the cartels? And I'm guessing that it also must be a coincidence that one of the largest tourist cities in Mexico is at war right now, right before Trump gives his State of the Union address today. A State of the Union address, by the way, that Trump will be able to use to brag about the fact that he worked with the Mexican military to kill this cartel leader, but simultaneously will be able to say, but look at how bad the cartel problem is in Mexico. And therefore, we have justification to conduct strikes and send our military in. It's a win-win for him. And of course, you know, anything to not talk about those Epstein files. They forget that. But I just wonder how the U.S. military is going to feel when they end up in Mexico fighting against this cartel, looking like the Spider-Man meme, whenever they realize that they're getting shot at with their own weapons, including 50 caliber rounds. You know what they say? All the world's a stage. And Trump and the U.S. are piss poor actors. Come on, bro. Like, can this be any more obvious at this point?
So let me now bring in Kurt Hackbarth. He's a journalist who knows something about this in Mexico. He's a writer, a playwright, covering Mexico and Latin America for Jacobin magazine. He's an analyst on the television programs Sin Muros and Mestizaje on Mexico's Canal Once. Once, I'm sorry, Canal Once, that's it. And co-host of Soberania, the Mexican Politics podcast. Welcome to the show, Kurt Hackbarth. How are you, Kurt?
Doing very well, Jimmy. That was a great intro by Nico. He actually said a lot of stuff that I was going to say. So
okay. So tell me. Here's an article over my shoulder from. It says U.S. backed killing a cartel boss that unleashed a wave of violence across Mexico. Could you tell me what exactly that means and what happened?
Yeah, there's a lot to pick apart here. On Sunday, the Mexican armed forces located and wound up killing one of the most wanted criminals, not only in Mexico, but in the world, who was Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, who was the head of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is actually a relative newcomer on the cartel scene in Mexico. It's not as old as the Zetas or the Sinaloa cartel, about 15 years old or so. But in that time, they came to have a substantial presence in Mexico, starting in the state of Jalisco, which is why it's the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, but expanding their presence north and south to both borders. So it was a very successful operation. The Mexican government carried it out, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, and that should have been the story. That it was a successful operation against, a very violent wanted criminal, right? But that wasn't the narrative that conformed to what most of the U.S. press and MAGA accounts, or Trump accounts rather, wanted, which is to give this portrayal of Mexico in chaos. A basket case, kind of out of control, the kind of country that would just need U.S. intervention or drone strikes or the like. So what the war of narrative was from Sunday, from when it started through Monday and into Tuesday, was this idea that, and you saw all kinds of crazy stuff, Jimmy. You saw AI images of planes on fire in the Guadalajara airport. Not true. You saw, basically AI images of the city of Puerto Vallarta in flames. Not true. There were disturbances. There were people taken out of their cars. There were cars burnt. But Puerto Vallarta was not in flames. And actually, Puerto Vallarta is largely back to normal now, right? But the war of narratives was such that they tried to create this idea of a Mexico out of control, just crying for U.S. intervention. And I think Nico's right. Just in time for Trump's State of the Union, with Trump, in a mess with Epstein and, the whole tariff thing and, low approval ratings, he wanted to take the credit for taking out El Mencho when it was the Mexican government that did it. And it was a very successful operation on the Mexican government's part. And
so what do you make of, so are you insinuating that Trump wants to inflame kind of just, unrest in Mexico, or that he wants to just overhype the unrest that's happening in Mexico so that he could do what?
Well, you've seen, ever since the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, you see this kind of this cowboy-like swagger on the part of the foreign policy, coterie around Trump, Marco Rubio, and obviously they've moved on to kind of put a stranglehold around Cuba. And actually, Trump has specifically said a number of times, they want to bomb Mexico. There is, a number of people within the Trump administration that would love to do that. Trump actually flirted with doing it in his first administration and was talked out of it. So it's actually quite open that Trump wants to take some kind of action against Mexico. He wants to make sure that they don't send oil to Cuba. And he thinks that he can take out the cartels through airstrikes or drone strikes or what have you, right? And just after Venezuela, they're that puffed up that I think they might, be willing to try it. So this is the thing. Nobody is saying that there weren't disturbances on Sunday. There were. And it's an unfortunate happenstance that when a cartel leader is taken out, there is retaliation on part of the cartel members for a number of reasons, because they think that, maybe it's part of a larger sweep to wipe them all out. So they try to, block roads and block access to their strongholds, because, a turf war breaks out. When, a capo is killed, a turf war breaks out between the factions of a cartel to see who's going to take control afterwards. It's also a show of muscle to say we're still in control, even though, our head was taken out. And it's important to point out, I think, that 25 National Guardsmen lost their lives in this operation, Mexican National Guardsmen, which is always the case. The Mexicans put their bodies on the line when it's the ammo, when it's military grades weaponry, as Nico pointed out, coming from the United States that fuels the whole thing. And he was absolutely right to point out the case of Paul Campo and Robert Sensi. Paul Campo, a longtime DEA agent, and Robert Sensi, a longtime, CIA stooge, were nabbed in December planning and plotting with this very cartel, Jalisco Nueva Generacion, to traffic some 220 kilos of cocaine and traffic weaponry into Mexico. It's actually right there in broad sight if you want to see it.
So does it seem like there's just factions inside of the U.S. DEA and the CIA that are facilitating the drugs and the drug cartels with weapons, or is it? And then there's some kind of outside Department of Justice agency that caught. I mean, it seems like to me that this is something that the CIA and the FBI and the DEA has done for decades. That they traffic in illegal drugs, cocaine, and whatever, and they also work hand in hand with the cartels. So why would they all of a sudden? Do you think what's your theory on why they would turn on that CIA guy and the DEA guy and arrest them for doing a thing that we know they've been doing forever?
It's a good question. I think there's some very complex turf wars going on here.
Okay.
For a long time, I think the DEA thought Mexico was their territory, their backyard, right? And they basically operated with near impunity in Mexico in the conservative governments of Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto before Andrés Manuel López Obrador came to power in 2018. One of the things that López Obrador did was to pass a law curbing the activities of U.S. intelligence agencies on Mexican soil, right? That they can't, in theory, bear arms, and they have to report and check in with Mexican authorities and a number of measures like that. DEA hated that. And there's been, of course, as we know, a whole laundry list of DEA scandals over the last few years. I mean, a laundry list, right? From the top to the bottom. So the DEA is, kind of persona non grata at the moment. And you see agencies like the FBI, which is supposedly, for domestic purposes, but obviously not, kind of trying to fill the void. And you see a turf war amongst U.S. intelligence agencies, all this alphabet soup of agencies, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, right? You now, even Homeland Security, ICE has its own intelligence, agency embedded there.
Right.
So what you see is, right, kind of with the DEA kind of on the outs, other U.S. agencies trying to rush in to fill a void, which is unfortunately kind of natural.
Okay, so and what's in it for Trump to go after these cartels that obviously, or that theoretically the factions inside the DEA, CIA, FBI are working with anyway? What's the plan? I don't understand what Trump's trying to accomplish. Do you?
They have to show that they're tough on drugs, right? At least in rhetoric, right? And they have to have some high profile actions to try to show that, so that they can get further budgets, right? Everybody's looking at ICE, and ICE is hogging all the budget now. The ICE budget is going up like this, much more than the DEA, the FBI, and the like. And they're looking at ICE and saying, if ICE is getting all that money, we have to justify us getting some of the cut. So you have to have some high-profile operations now and again, right? This has been a big part of U.S. strategy for years, the so-called kingpin strategy. And the kingpin strategy is we go after the capos, we go after the bigwigs, we go after the guys at the top. We take them out, we do perp walks, we do flashy headlines, we do flashy trials. But nothing really changes underneath, because it doesn't change the underlying dynamic. It doesn't change the dynamic, the social dynamic, the flight from the countryside caused by NAFTA and the free trade agreement, 30 years of neoliberalism in Mexico before López Obrador that hollowed out the state and created an opening for the cartels to go in. They don't want to touch all that, those structural things. So they do flashy capo hits and perp walks, and they're big media splashes, justifying budgets, justifying personnel, justifying a lot of weaponry, right? And so it keeps the whole machinery going.
And so, so here, according to this article from Common Dreams, let me just read this and get your take on it. The explosion of violence and instability. Now, was there an explosion of violence? I mean, there was some violence, right? There was some violence.
There was some violence, right? After the killing on Sunday, there were roadblocks set up. A number of people were taken out of their cars by force. Those cars were burned, right? There was, some instability in Guadalajara and the Puerto Vallarta area. Nobody wants to deny that happened, and certainly people who were affected, that was a very serious matter. But compared to what one might have thought would happen, right, with the taking out of one of the world's biggest capos, it actually wasn't as big as, one might have thought. And it certainly wasn't anywhere near as big as what people were trying to play up. You saw people like Laura Loomer, right, saying that they were taking U.S. Tourists hostage on highways and hotels. That never happened. You had people like Dan Dix, this Canadian libertarian, saying, oh, pray for us. The situation is terrible. And he's walking out in the street, which is all, pretty much in calm, right? You see people like Benny Johnson saying, oh, these liberals are stuck in Mexico and they're begging Trump to get out. And you had one of the people mentioned in that video saying, just totally not true. Just total fake news with fake images and, all kinds of stuff that just goes viral. Just total out of control stuff. And it becomes, not only a war of narratives, but it becomes basically a war of, this avalanche of fake news. If you go to Mexico now, almost all the countries in calm, and even Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta is basically back to normal. And interestingly, in a De Harris poll, which just came out today, 88% of the Mexican public agree with the operation, and 56% say it actually increased their opinion of President Sheinbaum. So there's obviously a delinking between what the Mexican public is seeing and what some of these hysterical, accounts are trying to play off online.
And just, I hate to ask you this question twice, but just so again, what's in it for Trump and his right-wing supporters to amp up the violence in Mexico?
I suspect that they're trying to create the conditions for U.S. intervention.
And so the U.S. could go into Mexico and they could take on the cartels?
They want to drone strike the cartels. Okay. But, it's also important to point out that right now they're in the process of reviewing the mandatory review of the free trade agreement, the USMCA agreement. And the Trump administration is pushing with everything to get its mitts on Mexico's energy sector, oil, lithium, strategic minerals, rare earths, and they are pushing hard on that. So even if they don't go in directly, they are trying to push hard on Sheinbaum to say, we could watch out, if Mexico doesn't give ground on the USMCA renegotiation, and especially the energy sector and rare earth minerals, which they don't want to have to get from Asia now. They want to get it from Latin America. Hence, the Trump corollary and that new national security doctrine that came out and the Dunn-Roe doctrine and all that stuff. They want to get, Mexico and Latin America's minerals, and if they have to do it at the point of the gun, they'll do that.
So that's what this, again, so this is just another economic war or an economic.
Largely.
Okay.
Largely, yeah.
So here I found interesting in this article, it said that critics have warned that if the U.S. attempted to bring about a total elimination of drug cartels using airstrikes and special operation forces, that this kind of violence and instability would happen. Quote, at best, U.S. military strikes in Mexico will weaken the cartels over the short term, wrote fellows Daniel DePetris and Christopher McIlhany in a July paper for the think tank Defense Priorities. At worst, they will cause the cartels to splinter even further, spiking the level of violence, straining the Mexican government's military resources, and causing significant blowback against Americans in both Mexico and the United States. So, well, do you think? I mean, did this accomplish anything positive? So this was an operation by the Mexican authorities. This wasn't the United States killing this guy, taking this cartel leader out. This was the Mexican authorities doing this. And is it is anything good going to come of this, do you think, or just going to be more chaos?
El Mencho was a very bad guy, so there's that. He was a very violent criminal. But I think the point of the article is very well taken. Whenever you take out a couple, what you do is you create a turf war that tends to splinter these organizations and make them even more difficult, right, to deal with. We saw this after Felipe Calderón declared his so-called war on drugs in 2006, which was based on the Plan Colombia, which devastated Colombia throughout the 80s and 90s and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. You saw, Felipe Calderón sending out the army and, trying to be the tough guy, and it wound up, splintering and spreading out cartel violence around the country. More recently, we saw a very similar situation when there was this strange kidnapping, it appeared, of El Mayo Zambada, who was part of the Sinaloa cartel. And you saw very much that. You saw a really bloody turf war take place in Sinaloa after that. And so I think that's important, right? The DEA and the FBI and all that, they march their they parade their scalps around, but it's the Mexican public that has to pick up the pieces afterwards when the turf wars happen, and when the splintering goes on, and when the violence spreads out to areas where it wasn't present before. So this could, in theory, go on and on and on and on, justifying more military, more expense, more this, more that, more militarization, when what the Obrador and the Sheinbaum governments are trying to do is attack the causes. Attack youth poverty, attack, youth unemployment, do infrastructure and culture and sports and employment programs. But it's hard to do that when you've got Trump breathing down your neck every single day. So you see Sheinbaum kind of trying to, like this jujitsu master, hold off Trump constantly so she can progress in her domestic program, but it's difficult.
So in this article, it says, United States forces were not reportedly involved in the operation that led to El Mencho's death. However, U.S. fingerprints are all over the attack. Do you agree with that?
From what I know, it was an attack carried out by the Mexican armed forces, the Mexican Army and the National Guard. And there was intelligence cooperation with the United States, despite whatever, the Laurel Loomers of the world would have, would try to have people believe. And, they're trying to, take excessive credit for it. Even Carolyn Levitt said it was carried out by the Mexican armed forces, right?
Okay.
Claudia Sheinbaum has not closed the door to intelligence cooperation with the United States. She said that's fine, as long as it takes, place in, a framework of respect for Mexican sovereignty, respect, for mutual countries as equals, and not as part of, a campaign to slip boots into the ground into Mexico, which nobody here wants, except for a tiny rump of, extreme right wingers here. Nobody in the Mexican public wants that.
And how is the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, doing? Is she actually, how is she governing? Is she doing like Obrador? Is she trying to help the workers and the common man get out of poverty, or or is she a tool of the WEF?
No, she's doing very well. And on the security front, she's actually posted some remarkable numbers. Homicides are down 40%. Fentanyl trafficking is down about half at the border. She's also continuing a lot of López Obrador social programs and adding new ones, also building out the country's train infrastructure, trying to get to universal health care. There's some exciting things going on in Mexico that if, all of the sensationalists weren't hogging up all the space, there'd be a lot more time to talk about. And Mexico is really using the state as finally as a lever of development, which is something that had been given up for 30 years with this idea that the private market were going to do everything. So through her what's called her Plan Mexico, she's trying to develop Mexico so that it doesn't just become, as it always was historically in a lot of cases, an exporter of cheap labor and raw minerals, but has its own supply chains, has its own semiconductors, its own satellites, its own infrastructure, its own value added. Mexico has lithium, dangerously close to the U.S. border, so it wants to take that lithium and do things with it. There's a lot Mexico is working on right now, and I think that's another thing that both Republican and Democratic administrations have never looked kindly on. Mexico developing too much. They want Mexico. It's the contradiction. They want Mexico to be not violent and not export migrants, but at the same time, they don't want Mexico to ever develop independently. Well, those two things can't coexist. It can't coexist. You have one or the other. And U.S. policymakers have always tried to have both. And
so, what do you say to the people who say that? Because I remember during her campaign, she was, I saw a photo of her with that someone, maybe it was the head of the the BlackRock, or maybe it was the head of the WEF, and people were saying,
I think it was Larry Fink.
Larry Fink. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what did people say about that?
Yeah, she did welcome BlackRock to National Palace. There's no getting around that.
Okay.
Not something a lot of people enjoyed seeing. You have to, when you're in an asymmetric relationship with the United States, you have to kind of massage some things. Right? That happened. I think in general, Sheinbaum has been very effective at towing the line with regards to Mexican sovereignty, and it hasn't been easy. Trump spent most of 2025 holding the tariff threat over Mexico's head if it didn't do exactly what he wanted, and she managed to get the tariffs postponed 4 times, to the point where Trump stopped talking about them and moved on to something else. So she's been effective in that regard. I think the problem is Latin America has not been sufficiently effective in coordinating regionally, and that includes Mexico. It hasn't put a regional face when Trump started bombing boats in the Caribbean. I think the response was too tepid. And then when Trump started, the stranglehold on Cuba, Mexico has backed off for now on sending oil. So if the Trump administration smells blood, they're going to go for broke. They're going to go for broke. They're going to go for more.
What?
And
why do you think there isn't more cooperation between the countries in Central and South America and Mexico?
It's been a long-standing, not to take responsibility away from the Latin American countries themselves, but it's been a long-standing U.S. policy to ensure that Latin America never truly unites, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. So every attempt by Latin America to do so obviously has been severely resisted by the United States.
Okay.
Some of the recent examples were ALBA, were UNASUR, you see MERCOSUR, you see the attempt by the Southern Cone to unite in the early 2000s. Boy, did the U.S. always try to get in there and stop it, even to the point of setting up a separate grouping, the Lima Group, right? So it's hard because they throw everything at it. And when I mean everything, that means, supporting coups, trying to, sabotage people, sabotage governments, supporting paramilitaries, including with Israeli weaponry and spyware. I mean, it's just constant. And that's going back to the Plan Condor of the 70s, up until, you saw Trump intervening in the Argentine legislative elections a few weeks ago, saying, if you don't vote the way I want, no bailout. Or, freeing Juan Orlando Hernandez right before the Honduran presidential election, who was sentenced to 40 years for drug trafficking.
Yes.
So, it's not to take responsibility away from the Latin American countries, but it's hard when you've got constant meddling and interventions.
And
that said, they have to step up and do it anyway. But, those are the conditions.
Before we let you go, any predictions on what the future for Mexico and the United States relationships?
Well, with regards to Mexico, I'm optimistic. Mexico has a very politically aware public. You see a lot of real groundwork by López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum over these 2 administrations. So there's a sense, with everything, despite everything that's going on, of optimism with what's going on. Unfortunately, the United States is just, it's a loose cannon, it's a rogue state, and it's just all over the place. So one day they're kidnapping Maduro. The next day they want to take us into a nuclear war with Iran. The next day they're, strangling Cuba, which has been traditionally, Mexico has always stood up for Cuba. So it's hard to share a common border with, an empire out of control. So I don't envy Mexico's foreign relations ministry. That said, they're going to have to face this because it's not going away. And just trying to keep your head down obviously doesn't work. And I think, that's becoming all the more clear.
Okay. Well, I know you got to run. I want to say I appreciate you making time for us. Thanks for informing our audience on what's actually happening in Mexico right now. Kurt Hackbarth, I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Okay. See you soon. All right. Over to Steph.
All right. You know what, Jimmy? It is time for us to go to Rumble.
Okay. Let's go to Rumble.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to Rumble. We'll see you there.
interesting. I haven't thought about AIPAC. And it's interesting. You're like the first to bring up AIPAC in years, which is interesting. Why did I say that? Not relevant to my day-to-day life.
Okay.
Which is just interesting.
Listen.
It's interesting you say that. JPAC perhaps more, but AIPAC less and less.
Okay. Fair enough.
Which is just interesting.
What's interesting about it?
That it's just interesting as you bring up AIPAC that it hasn't been part of, I'm just reflecting quite openly and honestly, hasn't been part of the day-to-day.
Okay, we are back, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see what I have here. Okay. Read that one. Okay, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. JEP World acronym. That's from AFIX. I don't know what that means.
Okay.
Uh-oh, back to Jim.